Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Before we start today, I'm excited to share some news about the podcast with you. I've really been thinking about how we can continue to support each other in our queer communities more. So I'm asking each guest to name a nonprofit of their choice, and I will make a donation in their name. But that's not all. This podcast has been a labor of love, and I don't want to sell advertising on the show because I don't want to get distracted from the important conversations we have here. I want to support our communities, and this is where you come in. I have set up a Patreon account at patreon.com/queerspirit. There are 4 levels of patronage to choose from, which offer gratitude gifts such as thank you shoutouts on the show, a sticker or enamel button with the Queer Spirit logo, and access to a live monthly meditation group. All Patreon funds remaining after the basic production costs will be added to the nonprofit donations. So go to patreon.com/queerspirit and help me to support our queer communities. My guest today is Elsa Asher. Elsa is a practitioner of somatics and ritual with a specialty in healing developmental and intergenerational trauma. They are non-binary and queer and grew up on Duwamish land currently known as Seattle, Washington. Elsa's ancestors are Ivory Jews from Southwest Asia and North Africa by way of the Pale Settlement and England, and European colonial settlers from England, Scotland, Ireland, Sapmi, and Germany. Elsa is a biodynamic craniosacral therapist, life coach, doula, and Koheneh, a Hebrew ritual facilitator. They hold a Master's of Science degree in Narrative Medicine from Columbia University and a Certificate of Jewish Studies from Machon Chana Institute and over 2,500 hours in somatics training. Elsa has taught at Columbia University, Touro University College of Osteopathic Medicine, and at various organizations and conferences. Today we discuss what it means to reconnect with our bodies in order to heal generational and developmental trauma. Elsa shares about the practices of ancestral connection and how we can begin to re-inhabit our own bodies for more healing. Learn more about Elsa at restorativesomatics.space. Hi, Elsa. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Nick. I'm so glad to be here with you.
So I thought I would have you start out by telling us the story of how you first got interested in somatic practices.
Yeah, so the real origin is my family and my ancestors. So I want to go back all the way back there and then kind of trace it forward.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up with parents from different backgrounds. My mom's family are European colonial settlers, and my dad's family are Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jewish refugees. And together, combined from their lineages, I grew up in a very animistic way. I didn't know that at the time or have that word. We weren't talking about it. We were just doing it, connecting with plants and with animals. And my mom is a holistic health healer and works with flower essences and herbs and hands-on kind of somatic work. And my dad has been a neonatologist, a pediatric specialist my whole life. So I kind of grew up in this context of health and healing, and that was kind of everything. And most of our family friends and my godparents and the people we spent time with worked in the health and healing profession or traditions. When I was in my teens, I got really interested in midwifery. I was born at home, and I grew up knowing and being family friends with the midwives who attended my birth with my mother. And my dad taught at their midwifery school. My mother did all this work with Penny Simkin, who started DONA International, which is a Doulas of North America certifying organization. So that was just kind of my familiar context. I went to college, and didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I studied writing, I studied biology and chemistry and religious studies. And a couple things happened in that time period. I had a period of 5 or 6 years where I was very religious in a Jewish mystical ecstatic practice that was, the mysticism part was really nourishing for me. And then the kind of dogmatic rule part was very oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in the dance of that from when I was like 19 to about 25. Inside of that context, I was married and was pregnant twice. And I lost one of those children or baby at 12 weeks, and then the second one at 26 weeks. And there was something about that experience. And they happened back to back in 1 year when I was 23.
Mm.
And that experience transformed me, because my world up until that point didn't hold the truth of that I could be pregnant and carry a pregnancy past the first trimester and have that child die. And so in order to continue living, like basically everything, not of choice, just out of necessity, everything sort of burned to the ground. And from those ashes, it was my choice if I wanted to re-inhabit myself and reshape and form my life, which required me to understand myself in the world in a much deeper and broader way than I had before, to include this truth of how life and death are intertwined and interrelated with each other. So it was really that experience that it wasn't such a strong pivot, but it just kind of nudged me towards the path of working with health and healing and working therapeutically and somatically. I've always been very fascinated with, how do people get sick? Why do people get sick? How do people get better? It's this very mysterious, like alchemical thing. Nothing seems to ever be like, well, this one thing happened and there's a direct causal relationship. And then this other thing happened and that was the direct causal relationship of someone getting well. Things are often so much more complex than that. So I just kind of through my own healing process, my own grief and integration of that, both deep grief and also there were aspects of that experience that was very traumatic and aspects of my religious experience that were traumatic somatically that I needed to integrate. And in addition, I had always been like intellectually very interested in all of this. I wrote long papers on why the C-section rate was very high in the United States and why that was a problem. I wrote about feminist perspectives on FGM. Like there were many things around reproductive health and bodies and politics that was very interesting to me. So these kind of what I like to read about and think about and write about, and the work that I needed to do in my body to feel whole and to be willing and able to proceed into my life as a 23, 24-year-old, those kind of married each other. And from that place, I started working as a doula. And the first 6 months of working as a doula were incredibly difficult. And I learned so much. I am still so grateful for all those parents and babies who let me be with them in their journey and learn from life and learn from their bodies and their experiences about that process. And one of the things that I noticed was people's experiences that they had had in their bodies were very relevant to the birth process. What their sex life was like, if they had had injuries in their body, if they had experienced sexual trauma, if they experienced other kind of trauma or shock or betrayal, what their embodied experiences of being born themselves, or their experience of nursing or breastfeeding with a parent, or their experience of being 3, all of that was relevant to how they experienced the process of birth. And I could feel that, and I needed some training to know how to work with that and to speak to that with clients and to support a kind of touching into that and metabolizing it. And then I also myself would have these pretty dramatic, like trauma responses after a birth. It would take me like a week to recover. And I didn't understand why other doulas seemed to be able to have more clients than me and feel fine. And I would just totally lose myself. So I needed to learn And I basically said to myself, like, either I need to not ever do this work again, or I need to find out what's happening for me and how to show up for myself, and what's happening with my clients and how to show up for them.
Yeah.
And that's really what the answer to that question has been the last 9 years of study and practice of working somatically with people. And it started with working somatically with myself and my classmates. And then I started my practice and really formally started my practice in 2016.
Great. Well, thank you for that story about all of that. I really appreciate that. One thing that you said that I would like to return to was that you consciously decided to re-inhabit yourself, you said. And I think that's a really important piece, especially when it comes to trauma and somatic work. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what that means to you and how that has been for you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot recently, about when I was young, how I really inhabited myself as a kid and even as a teenager. Even though I found adolescence really challenging because I had the gift and blessing of being brought up in a home where androgyny was very normative. And my mother really explicitly taught me and my brother, like, gender's a construct and you can be however you want and do whatever you want and dress however you want. And it doesn't matter. You just get to be authentic as yourself. And that was awesome. And I was totally unprepared for being gendered.
Mm-hmm.
In my transition to adolescence. I went from this, like, I identify as non-binary and trans, and that was very supported in that, like, androgyny utopia world. And then I feel like turning 12 or 13, it was like running joyfully. And then, like, all of a sudden there's a brick wall and I just, like, smashed into a brick wall. And all of a sudden the world is like, you are a girl.
Uh-huh.
And that means that you're cis. That means you're hetero. That means you need to be pretty in this way. It means you need to speak in this way. It means you should stop playing sports. It means you need to behave in this way with boys. It was like all of these things that I was like, none of those are interesting to me. I'm bad at all of them. There's nothing, like, exciting or generative or life affirming for me in that. And if I don't do them, I'm bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was that experience. And then I think another layer of it is when I became religious. So I'll back up for a moment. So there was that experience and the management of it, which I know is very common for queer and trans kids, right? Like, whenever for some people, they don't have a family that's very accepting and inclusive and supportive. And so that hitting the wall may happen at any point in any kind of way for each person, but that's when it happened for me. And I sort of found my way with that and came out in high school to a few people. And I didn't feel like it was okay or safe for me to be out at school or in a larger way, but I could tell my brother, I could tell my parents, I could tell one of my closest friends. And I was just in college. I was just starting to be okay with it. And I went to the new school for the first 2 years of school, where there was a lot of queer and trans kids and students. But it kind of, like, at the same time that I was just sort of opening in that way, I was also opening in my real calling to live a life dedicated to spiritual practice. And those two things opened at the same time. And that was a very generative time. And also, unfortunately, what came along with that mystical practice was this expectation that I follow what I experienced as a very regimented life. And it wasn't so much the more action things that were difficult for me, but having rules placed upon my body felt very oppressive and counter to the sort of opening that was happening. And I was kind of just wrestling in that. So I kind of, like, had to go back into the closet and pretend I wasn't queer, pretend I wasn't trans, although I didn't have that language for myself then. I didn't have the language of being non-binary then. This was back in, like, 2004, 2005, 2006. I'm just catching my thought.
Mm-hmm.
So after that experience of the 2 pregnancy losses, it was kind of like the spell of, or the like wrestling dance I had been between mystical, ecstatic, spiritual practice and these rules of my body and my queerness and my gender. Like all of that just sort of, that's part of what got burnt to the ground in my kind of dissolution of how I experienced myself in the world through that grief. And from that was a real reawakening of like feeling the freedom to move into re-inhabiting myself as queer and non-binary. And that's really when I came out again to myself, again to my family, again to my friends, and then really felt safe enough to be out and speak of and identify myself and express that in my everyday life, both personally and professionally.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in about 2010, 2011.
Yeah, I think that all of those things are really important for queer people to recognize, and especially around our relationship to our own traumas and our own history and our own experience in that way. I've worked with a lot of people who don't even identify experiences they've had as traumatic, even when to some people they're kind of blatantly traumatic. And I won't give those experiences, but there are definitely things that are, what sometimes in some circles I've been in around working with trauma, they call big T trauma versus little t trauma.
Yes.
But there's a lot of little t traumas that happens, especially to queer folks, around microaggressions and that kind of thing, that I think are really important to recognize those experiences and how we can sort of get knocked out of ourselves. So I think this idea of re-inhabiting ourselves, re-embodying ourselves is really important, which is also one of the reasons I really wanted to have this conversation with you, because you do work physically and somatically, and that I think that's one of what I personally think is one of the best ways of working with and healing trauma is through the body. So I know that one of the ways that you work with trauma is working with intergenerational trauma and developmental trauma. And before we even start talking about them, I wonder if you could define some of those concepts for our listeners before we get into that.
Yeah, that's a good question. They're not easy for me to define, and they're also really simple. So I think of intergenerational trauma as the very simple statement and truth of that what has happened to and with and inside of our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, all of our ancestors before them, that matters to us. Just like how what happens when we're born or what happens when we're gestating inside of our gestational parent, that matters to us and it lives inside of our bodies. When we go inside of ourselves, all of that is there. I don't care if something happened 1,000 years ago, it still lives inside of our bodies and we know things. And one of the things that's really exciting about being a practitioner in this time is all of this really awesome research and scholarship is being documented and articulated about how much we know kind of in the subconscious or somatic, like in the felt sense, how much we can know that is not about it's written down on a piece of paper and that's how we know it's true knowledge, but that we can feel it and we're willing to re-legitimize sensory information, re-legitimize feeling as a real kind of knowledge. And so it really comes down to, like I said, what has happened before us in our lineages lives inside of us, and we know that. And so because we're not separate, we're not also then separate from these larger cultural experiences or experiences of power, experiences of oppression, or experiences of violence, or experiences of war or forced migration. All of that is in us and is so much more shaping us and how we experience ourselves and in the world than we often understand. Like you were saying, so often people don't even realize that something is trauma. And I just think of trauma as something that for whatever reason, we weren't able to metabolize and integrate as it was happening. And that could be there were too many things happening at once. It could be that things were happening too quickly. It could be that there was not enough to support or social connection to stay oriented to the moment. So the person lost a sense of connection with time and space. All of those can be factors of why something is traumatic. And there's also a difference between an event trauma and what I would call developmental trauma or persistent trauma. So event trauma could be like, I was going along in my life and then I had a really scary car accident. And that's a traumatic event. And the consequences of that could be, various somatic sensations and experiences. So that kind of event trauma can happen. And there's the way that I was trained, there are particular techniques and kind of sequences or ways of working with event trauma. I find all of that really interesting. And when a client brings that kind of experience to our work together, I'm happy to work with it. But where I'm most interested is in the persistent piece. So it's not about everything you were going along and then you had this scary car accident experience, but it's like when we're talking about being queer and trans, or any other identity and experience that is not the white supremacy ideal of the white, cisgendered, hetero, elite, owning class male is the supreme standard of humanity. Anything that's any divergence from that is subjected to structural oppression. And so that's not just like a one-time thing. Like once someone misgendered me, once someone was anti-Semitic, once I felt like I couldn't be out. It's like that's an ongoing experience over time. And that is a totally different thing than an event trauma. And the same thing with development as children. It could be all kinds of factors, whether there's a lot of stress in the family or one or both of the parents are dealing with a mental health issue or depressed or very anxious, or there are structural issues like not enough access to food or housing instability, parents acting out abuse patterns, parents in addiction patterns, whatever the factors are. That's not something that just happens once. That's something that is an ongoing factor as a child is working to develop themselves. And it's not to pathologize any of that. My work is really based on depathologizing things and just being with them and seeing them for what they are. Because when we take off the place of, is this good or is this bad, then we just come to a place of being with and feeling. And in my experience, this was how I was trained and this is how I practice. I know this because I've done it in my own body over and over and over again, which is when we actually can just settle into the moment and feel what's happening. Something else starts to move through the space and it starts to metabolize and integrate the energy and the content of that trauma. And in that metabolization, something else becomes possible. And usually it's through actually going through the wound and feeling deeper and deeper and deeper into it, that at the center of that is what we are most wanting for ourselves and in our lives.
Yeah. And I imagine for some people, if you were to tell them that before you started working with them, they'd be like, I don't want to do that. That sounds scary and painful.
That's the thing, though, is like, so that's where we're headed, but it's okay if we're not there yet.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's not that we need to sustain that for long periods of time. Like how I was trained was to really assess where is someone's capacity to really be present with their experience in the moment and to feel themselves and to feel in connection with me as another person with them. Mm-hmm. Once they can do that in the moment, like, let's go for it. Let's feel the things. Let's metabolize it. And that's not a static state. It might be that they can do that. We're in that together for 20 minutes and then it starts to be too much. And then that's when we use practices of pendulation. So we might move our attention elsewhere, kind of like taking a break and then we can come back, or titrating it and going slower. And because always balancing, like what I call deepening and broadening, deepening into an experience, feeling it more, And sometimes we need to broaden, which is like orienting to the present time and space, orienting to what feels good in your body, orienting to maybe something that feels good on your body. Like, does your sweatshirt feel good? Or do you have a blanket that feels nice to touch? Or do you have an animal in the house that you can make contact with? So we're always doing that balance of deepening and broadening, because it's not about re-experiencing everything in a manner in which you first experienced it, because then that's not actually changing anything. What we want to do is bring the encapsulated, unintegrated experience into contact with presence in this moment. And that presence, that's really where my healing work and spiritual work are the same, because that felt sense of presence, which we have many, many words for and is ineffable, which is why we have so many words to try to articulate it, that I feel when I'm with a client and we're really just being together around what is happening for them. That's the same feeling I have when I'm praying. That's the same feeling I have when I'm singing or receiving a blessing from someone or offering a blessing from someone. The same feeling I have when I offer blessings to the moon on the Hebrew holiday of Rosh Chodesh. There's the beginning of each month. It's what I feel when I light Shabbat candles or bake bread or make grain offerings to the earth or talk with my ancestors on the yahrzeit, the anniversary of their death. It's all the same feeling. It's that. And I think so many of us know that, and we talk about it in different ways, we access it in different ways, but it's that space where it's just like, oh, I'm here. And there's just this sort of basic, essential pleasure of being alive in the moment together.
So I wonder if you can share a little bit more about some of the ways that you work with this. I mean, you're speaking more conceptually, but maybe for our listeners who are like, okay, but what does this look like? And what would it feel like to actually do this work? Like how, like I know you do some actual physical touch work with the body and some that more just talk work kind of thing. Can you just share some of those ways that you work with that?
Yes. So my physical touch work is based in craniosacral therapy, and I use a biodynamic approach, which means it's not about fixing the body or readjusting, but about supporting conditions for the body to integrate and heal itself. And craniosacral therapy comes out of osteopathic medicine, which was articulated and kind of taught in institutions by Andrew Taylor Still, and he learned those healing traditions from Shawnee people. So this work is really an indigenous healing tradition that then was appropriated by white people a couple hundred years ago and then has had its own kind of professional history beyond that. But it's important to acknowledge that the origin of this work. So that's the hands-on work that I practice. Mm-hmm. And it's not different from what I'm talking about conceptually, because I'm really actually just in physical contact with a part of someone's body, either of their choosing, like they direct me to where something hurts or where they would like some attention. Or I may feel an impulse like, oh, I'm feeling an impulse to hold your head or hold your feet. And of course, we're always working with consent and choice in our work together. But it's not different. Like I'm doing the same thing inside myself, which is I'm just listening and being with and being curious and appreciating. This is something that my teachers, John Chitty and Anna Chitty, taught me, which is every time you're feeling someone's body and you notice a pattern or a shape, like the cranial bones might be in a particular shape or like a pattern of the nervous system. Like there's this settling, and right when the settling happens, there's this like spike into the sympathetic nervous system. Whatever it is that I'm noticing, first just appreciate it and be curious about it. Because really, like we know this, nothing and no one likes to change when we're like, you're bad. And I'm not willing to understand you, and you should change now. And that thing is going to be like, no, get away from me, probably swear. And so it's like, but if you approach someone or something with like, I see you, tell me about what service, what purpose, how you're serving this person. How does this shape or this pattern, this gesture, this arrangement of the bones, like what purpose is this serving? And can I recognize that purpose and appreciate, thank you for holding this for me until I was ready, willing, and able to be with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the thing about curiosity that I love is you can't be curious and be in a overly sympathetic aspect of your nervous system or overly parasympathetic. I call it being in the window of presence, which is where I can be active or restful, but I'm in a range where I can stay present with it.
Mm-hmm.
So curiosity is like a loophole to getting present. And so often what I'm doing is helping just people to be curious about their experience in their bodies. And I do that through I'm curious about their experience in their bodies. So when I'm doing hands-on work, it's a combination of we're talking and doing that somatic exploration while my hands are in contact with their body. And with online work, we're doing the same thing. We just don't get to have the hands part,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm still listening. And the hands are an important part because physical contact does something physiologically. There's a co-regulating aspect to it. There's an organizing, coherence building aspect to it. And it's really like my hands are an extension of my heart, which is an extension of my wide and caring perception. And so the online work is basically I'm still doing all of that. In terms of a structure, I really work with intention. And this is something that anyone who's listening can bring into their lives in their own personal practice, is working with intention to help to organize. Intentions are organizing access, and it allows what's in the space to start to gather around that intention. And so because I'm not working in a place of you're pathologized and I'm like a special healer, I tell my clients all the time, like, there's nothing special about me. I don't have this like cool secret thing that I paid a lot of money to learn how to do that's going to like make you better.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm willing and able to be present with you in your experience. And that in and of itself, with your intention and your choice to show up to this work, that will start to move something and transform something in accordance with what you're intending and wanting. And so the intention is really like, where are we aiming our arrow? And then we stay oriented to that through the process. Because I want people to get out of working together what they want. And we can't know if they are if we don't have a way to sort of track and measure that. So when someone says their intention, often my follow-up question is, what would that mean for you in your life? What would that actually feel like? Someone's like, I want a relationship. Okay, what does it feel like to be in relationship? And then what are the sensations of that? And can we actually start cultivating those sensations today? Not waiting, like, if only I had this thing that I want, then I would feel okay. We all know we can have the thing that we want and we might not feel okay inside, because it's not really about the thing. It's about what can we access in ourselves to be present in the moment. Can we feel pleasure? What does it feel like to take in love? We might want a relationship, but it's terrifying to actually feel loved. So we can start cultivating sensations and orienting to sensations and being curious about what supports feeling of those sensations. And we can do that now in the moment. That being said, that is not to say that structural oppression, racialized trauma that is historical and institutional and persistent, none of these things are episodic. That is a constant trauma, a constant stress on people's bodies and experiences. And I want to continually bring that into my own awareness and into this conversation, because any of us who have white advantage have the comfort to not always feel that. And that comfort is predicated on the exploitation and murder of Black and Brown people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's our ethical imperative not to focus on other people's pain necessarily, yes, to act in justice, but I think I want to talk something about, I don't know if I'm being clear here, but something about our own responsibility to feel the truth ancestrally, who we come from in our lineages and how they are located in that hierarchical ladder of white body supremacy. And that's really where the personal healing work and the collective healing work intersect. And I think somatics has a very potent role to play in this because, and this is why I've been talking to my somatic therapy practitioner colleagues, it's like we have trained ourselves to be able to sit in the fire of big experiences. And what better use of those skills to then sit in the fire of the truth of what has happened and what is still happening and how that lives in us and how we relate to it wherever our social location is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for bringing that into the conversation. I think it is really important, and it's still, we don't have the answer right now, and we're just navigating all of that and doing our best to figure that out, how to heal that, undo that, and to recover that for those we have disenfranchised and oppressed.
Yeah, and we'll find our way. And I think the beginning of every repair process begins with telling the truth. And to tell the truth means to feel it and deny the way that we are implicated in it. And it's good, it's healing to tell the truth, even if it's incredibly uncomfortable. And that's where I really am thinking about and talking about what does it mean to be somatically courageous, to be willing to feel into those places that if we could, we would like to avoid because they're gross or scary or violent, but that we actually can find resource in our body and support with each other to feel deeply into the places of that truth. And I think we can feel and do so much more than we think that we can. And I really want to support that emphasis on presence and being courageous.
Yeah. And as you said, that comment about going into the part that feels painful, and I was like, oh, but that's scary. I think that's where, slowly inching towards pushing into as a culture, like we have to go back to that pain that we've been ignoring for hundreds of years now.
Because we're not, and this is something that I've learned from Resmaa Menakem's work, because we're not feeling it ourselves, we're pushing it through the bodies of Black people, we're pushing it through the bodies of Indigenous people and other people of color. It doesn't go away because we don't feel it. We're just weaponizing it, and it's fueling our investment in white body supremacy. It's fueling our willingness to perpetuate these systems of power. And that's where it's like, take it back, take the responsibility. All of this feels like a projection, like let me do some horrible genocidal and chattel enslaving things to you. And then I feel terrible inside of myself. And then I don't want to feel that. So I project that onto you. And then it's like, oh, you're so bad. And I'm going to make that into a whole social structure and political structure. And then it's like, wait a minute, let's actually rewind that to that place where we felt horrible inside of ourselves. And together, can we sit in that horror? Because through that wound is what we want.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we could just go talk another hour on this, but we need to be wrapping up.
Yes.
So as we move in that direction, I wonder if you can share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish.
I love this question. I want to use this as an opportunity to give a shout out to Lori Connor. She's the first writing teacher, mentor of mine who's queer, butch woman who was married and had a child and recognized my queerness. And her mentorship of me as a 17-year-old was transformative and supported me to come out to myself and supported me as a writer and as an artist and a feeler and thinker. So I just want to honor her and note when people decide to be teachers and mentors to young people, the transformational liberatory potential of those encounters is not to be underestimated. So just appreciating all those who are doing that work in the world and appreciating Connor for the role that she played in my life all those years ago.
Okay. So Elsa, where can people find you and learn more about your work?
You can find me online on my website is restorativesomatics.space. Or if that's hard to type in, you can just go to elsaasher.com. They go to the same space. That's my website that has links to everything. And on Instagram, my handle is tendernessftw. And then I'm on Facebook just under Elsa Asher. And I'd be happy to hear from any of your listeners if folks have follow-up questions or things that they're curious about or resources that they would like to know about to learn more. I'm happy to be contacted.
Okay, great. And I will have those links in the show notes so people can also just find them there. Well, thank you for being here and sharing about your work and talking about this important subject of trauma. And I think it's an important conversation to continue to have as we navigate through these times that we're in these days in the summer of 2020.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I really appreciate the work that you're holding. And it's very heartening anytime I get to talk with other queer and trans healing or health practitioners. And I appreciate the threads that you're holding and the work that you're producing from that.
Do you feel lost or stuck? Or are you alone on your healing journey? If you're seeking guidance or support, I'm here to help. I offer online coaching and counseling for queer spiritual folks from all over. Schedule your free consultation with me now by going to queerhealingjourneys.com. I look forward to supporting you on your path. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.